We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
With the financial markets still in turmoil, banks, currencies, even countries struggling to return to normal, the free market is in trouble. Viable options scarce, sparking global protests against the rich 1%.
We want to find the quick fix, but it doesn't exist.
Jeffrey Sachs, an academic superstar known for his controversial work on shock therapy, a theory that was applied and tested in dramatic fashion with the privatization of state resources in South America and Russia.
If we don't cooperate, so it's just a bunch of regional powers that are scrambling with each other, that has been shown time and again to be among the most dangerous times for the planet.
What went wrong and what are the stakes? An honest conversation with one of the most controversial economists of our time. Jeffrey Sachs talks to Al Jazeera. Jeffrey Sachs, thanks so much for talking to us.
Pleasure, thank you.
Let's start with the European sovereign debt crisis. Are European leaders now on track to sorting Greece out?
Sort of. This is
not entirely.
Not entirely.
Why?
First, it's complicated. Whenever a government has borrowed so much that it has great difficulty in repaying, it isn't simple to work it out. One has to make choices about the time path of repayments, about how to alter existing contracts, how much more to lend when a government isn't creditworthy. And those decisions are both technical and they are political. Europe has had a hard time making these decisions, both because they're hard in and of themselves, but also because there are 17 countries.
Should the system itself be perhaps tinkered? Some would say, if we go back to how this crisis in the US began, it began with the subprime mortgages, banks giving loans to people whose financial situations didn't look good, but they thought, hey, even if he defaults, I'll take his house, and house prices are going up until everyone defaults and then house prices are crashing. So it kind of creates almost an incentive for default, doesn't it?
I think the problems in the US go back well before that. Because if you look at our labor market problems, it's been 38 years since the earnings of the median male worker, the man in the middle of the income distribution, has seen an increase of earnings. 38 years, men in the middle of the income distribution haven't had a benefit of rising earnings because the education system hasn't been adequate, the skills training hasn't been adequate. So this goes back a long time. My view of the financial bubble is that it had many different reasons for getting started, but one of them was to respond to unemployment of especially men in the manufacturing sector. So the Federal Reserve said, well, let's cut interest rates, let's ease credit, let's get mortgages out to stimulate construction activity and hire workers in the construction sector. It came to a bad end. The point I'm making is that America's structural problems go back even before the beginning of the housing bubble. And if we want to get out of this crisis,
you've got to go back and fix the basics.
We have to fix the basics. Now, nobody wants to hear that because fixing the basics means I don't have a solution for the next 2 years, which looks terrific.
Not when my re-election campaign comes up.
I can say that as a professor, but a politician might not want to say it. But frankly, I keep thinking that if we just go the politician's road, we'll have one gimmick after another. The years add up, and you look back, and what have you accomplished? Just a lot of new debt, a lot of gimmicks, no solution. So we better take a longer-term view of this issue, even though we don't want to. We want to find the quick fix, but it doesn't exist.
All right, and then the point you were talking about, how they made credit readily available and kind of relaxed the rules a little bit. Has anything changed there in the system of financial banking? Have there been any new regulations to control collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, or credit default swaps? Some of these tools that kind of shared the misery, if I could say, that allowed the bad loans to be put together, bunched up and shared between everyone so that when that bubble bursts, a lot of people are harmed and not just the original banks making the loan.
We still have what I would call a hyperactive Federal Reserve Board, which is of interest for the whole world because so many countries around the world still use the dollar as their key reserve currency or still peg their own national currencies to the dollar. What the Fed has done for a long time now is that when the unemployment is high, the Fed pushes short-term interest rates very low, floods the market with liquidity. Now, it also has supported in the past deregulation of the subprime market and allowing excess leverage. But the idea in the Fed's mind has been whenever there's high unemployment, pump up liquidity.
So nothing's really changed then, is what it sounds to me like.
Exactly. The problem with that is that it's led to one bubble after another. Not necessarily the same bubble. Maybe the bubble shows up first as a dot-com bubble. Maybe the next time as a subprime bubble. Maybe the next time as a bubble in Chinese real estate or in minerals or in staple food prices or in some other commodities. And I feel that the Fed has been much too volatile in its own actions. But it feels that it should just keep pumping. It's, of course, given us a new name, quantitative easing, for this.
Why is that? Some suggest it's because the banking industry is too close to government institutions like the Federal Reserve. I mean, at the height of the financial crisis in 2008, we had a former Goldman Sachs banker as the US Treasury Secretary, whose solution was take money from the people, give it to the banks in the Wall Street. Is that the reason?
There are lots of reasons. The tight connection of Wall Street and government is an obvious feature of the American system. But the Fed has other interests as well. The Fed chairman wants to get unemployment down as fast as possible. Of course, the public wants that too, but the Fed chairman wants to be reappointed. So the Fed chairman wants to make the president happy. The president wants low unemployment. So there's a lot of grasping for gimmicks as far as I'm concerned. Rather than looking at the longer-term problems and asking how we're going to solve this, it's a lot of gimmickry. If interest rates are pushed down to near zero, I regard that as a dangerous gimmick because it's likely to start just the next bubble soon after the previous one has burst. There are a lot of incentives in this world to try to make short-term fixes. And the politics, the political economy, the links of industry and government, the time horizon of politicians, the wishful thinking of economists who say, don't worry, we have all the dials, just turn this, just turn this. All of that has added into this very, very short-term and I think short-sighted approach to economic management.
And meanwhile, one of the things that's really surprising in this is that this public taxpayer money is going towards bonuses for some of the banks that were accused of getting us into this trouble?
Another part of the whole scene has been that the banks have said, leave us deregulated, we know how to run things, don't put government into meddle. Then with that freedom of maneuver, they took huge gambles and even made illegal actions and then broke the world system. As soon as that happened, then they rushed in and said, bail us out, bail us out. If you don't bail us out, we're too big to fail, you have to save us. As soon as that happened, they said, oh, don't regulate us, we know what to do.
We'll take
and they
care of it
almost
now.
went back to their old story. And the public is standing there amazed because we just bailed you out. How can you be paying yourself billions of dollars of bonuses again? And the bankers say, well, we deserve it. What's your problem? And the problem that the Occupy Wall Street and other protesters have is you don't deserve it. You nearly broke the system. You gamed the economy. You're paying mega fines, yet you're still in the White House. You're going to the state dinners. You're paying yourself huge bonuses. What kind of system is this? When I talk about this in the United States, I'm often attacked. Oh, you don't believe in the free market economy. I say, how much free market can there be? You say deregulate. The moment the banks get in trouble, you say bail them out. The moment you bail them out, you say go back to deregulation. Right. That's not a free market. That's a game. And we have to get out of the game. We have to get back to grown-up behavior.
You know what it sounds like? The global financial system is increasingly based on one thing, greed.
Of course, it is based on greed. And
how to make as much return as quickly as possible without assuming any responsibility, or as little as responsibility as possible, from where the money is going or what's being done with it.
There is a lot of greed and there's very little accountability. But there is something else, which is that globalization has opened up a lot of unregulated space in the world. If you can get your money beyond the political boundary, you're home free from a certain point of view. A lot of countries feel their banks are more powerful than the governments these days. One wonders in the United States sometimes whether the government is regulating the banks or the banks are determining government policy. Of course, it's been more the second way.
I know you're into a lot of going back and fixing the basics and the structural issues, but in the meantime, a global financial system is ticking over and it's still working. Shouldn't there at least be, in this short time, shall we say, in the short period, some kind of re-engineering of that system? Shouldn't we see a better sharing of loss and profit and risk between investor and debtor, for example?
The one basic idea that has truth to it that needs to be implemented in the short term rather than long term is to require that banks recapitalize and not take on so much risk or leverage, so-called. In other words, what's the extent to which your own money is at risk versus other people's money? And if you're allowed to borrow a massive amount from the market against a very small capital base of the bank itself, then the incentives go haywire. And this is what happened. So there is at least an attempt to require a recapitalization of the banks. There has been some tightening of the regulations, though by far not enough. And there has not been enough global cooperation, because one of the things that happens, of course, is that the U.S. claims, partly erroneously and a little bit true, if we regulate, then the transactions are just going to go
elsewhere,
to City of London, or they're going to go to the next zone or to the next tax haven. And so that's why the G20 as an institution that brings together the world's largest economies is potentially so vital, because it could enforce the kind of cooperation to enable national governments to say, yes, we're going to do the right thing at this point. One of the things that's on the G20 agenda right now is a financial transactions tax. The idea being that if one taxes at a very, very low rate, maybe 5 cents per $100 of transaction, that would stop some of this frenetic short-term transacting. It would make the markets more stable, and it would also raise some revenues.
All right. Now, you're an advocate of more taxes on the rich in order to fund better investment in the masses. One might say, though, can we really trust governments and give them more money? Look how they've behaved so far.
Well, government has behaved badly for the last 30 years, but in the United States.
Why do we want to give them more money then? How can we trust them? You talked about the regulators, some of them being too close to the financial industry.
If the only choice were to give money to the way government is right now, one would say, as many do, well, why would we ever do that? But I'll tell you one thing that is even worse than that, and that's to function without a government. And that's how close we're coming right now.
Anarchy.
It's anarchy, massive deregulation, letting the rich prevail and the powerful prevail over the poor, leaving people to their fate, recklessness, lack of investment, lack of public education. That's where the real disaster lies. So my point is not that this government is working. My point is we better fix government, because a country without a functioning government, or a country with a government that's so starved of revenues that the government can't function, is also not going to solve any problems. Maybe the rich will somehow be able to escape and behind their gated communities or in their helicopters or in their Gulf Streams, maybe they'll be able to find a place to fly to. but the world's going to be awfully unhappy, and countries will be very, very divided and unhappy if they don't have functioning governments to help.
Well, you know what the opponents are, I'm sure you've heard them of that thinking say. They say if you keep increasing taxes on the rich, it'll simply stifle the entrepreneurial spirit, the ability to get the economy moving, to create jobs, to employ people. How do you respond to that?
We've been cutting taxes on the rich for the last 30 years in the United States, since Ronald Reagan came to power. So I'm not at the end of a long chain of raising taxes on the rich. I'm trying to be at the beginning of a turn where we start taxing the rich again. Because over the last 30 years, it's been a story of tax cuts at the top, creating tax havens, the Internal Revenue Service siding with major companies to let them put their money into the Caymans or into Bermuda or into some other tax-free zone through what we call transfer pricing. It's been a lot of gimmicks on behalf of a lot of rich and powerful people. And the taxes that are paid by some of the richest, take Mr. John Paulson, the famous hedge fund manager in New York City, who took home a paycheck of $5 billion one year, another paycheck of $3.7 billion. He teamed up with Goldman to create this toxic brew that then they peddled to the German banks. He walked away so far. No responsibility for having teamed up with Goldman and what Goldman ended up paying for financial fraud. But more than that, his tax rate on those earnings is 15%. That's a scandal. That's called carried interest. It's a gimmick in the US tax laws that have allowed hedge fund owners, many of them billionaires, to pay among the lowest rates in the United States. Why?
Okay, but
why have the politicians protected them all along?
Well,
you know why? Very simple. They pay for the politicians.
Well, their official argument is if you keep imposing, in the era of globalization, if you keep imposing taxes on the rich and the corporations, this money will simply find itself and its way to invest in another country that doesn't impose those taxes. Wouldn't you be putting, in the global era, you got to play the same game as everyone else, right or wrong?
Well, right in that that's what they say. If you dare touch us, we'll move from New York to Connecticut. We'll move to New Jersey. Yeah, right. We'll move to someplace else. You know, some of these people might do that. Let them go. But the real point, because they've actually helped to bring down a system right now.
But they'll take the money with them, Professor, won't they?
Yeah, I don't know how much money they'll take when they stop leaning on all of the benefits that they get from the American economy and American society and all the privilege that they have. But aside from that, if we had the G20 working together to say, you know, we've really reached the end of the line where the bankers are gaming us, the governments, where they're playing us as fools by telling you, don't do that because he'll come to me, telling me, don't do that because I'll go to him. If the G20 said, you know, we do need financial regulation, we shouldn't have the world run for the benefit of billionaire hedge fund owners who are deregulated. We should have the world run for the sake of society, for people, average people who live in our countries, who would like their children to go to school, would like the roads to be paved, would like normal science and technology to be able to address problems of energy and water and clean air. That's the kind of country our people want. We don't want to be run by the hedge fund owners. We don't like their games. We don't like the tricks. Let's all get together and have a common platform of regulation. Let's squeeze Bermuda and the Cayman Islands and all these other tax havens so that they can't abuse the system. Let's agree that we're no longer going to play the game of banking secrecy, which allows trillions of dollars of wealth to escape the tax authorities. You see, it's not an accident, this system that has grown up. This system has grown up for the abuse of wealth. And I think in the end, either we can try to live in such a world and suffer the consequences, or we can try to do something about it.
So when you talk about action on a global level, that makes me think of the United Nations. Why haven't we seen, and of course you advise, I should point out, the Secretary General of the United Nations, why haven't we seen enough initiative on the part of UN agencies to focus attention to reform of things that you were talking about, like the hedge funds, like the CDOs, all these murky tools?
As you can imagine, the rich countries have said to the UN and others, that's our business. That's not your business. And that really is a big part of how the world system works.
But the UN is supposed to represent all of us, isn't it?
Well, it's supposed to represent all of us, but there's a kind of governing board. And the nation states, and especially the powerful nation states, preserve their prerogatives. And in economics, the most powerful countries of the world preserve their prerogatives.
Do you speak to Ban Ki-moon about these issues?
Of course.
What's his response?
Well, he's very concerned about them. But he doesn't have the mandate from the United States and the UK to address those problems.
Can't he raise it through one of the agencies without a mandate? Get one of the UN agencies which issue reports about famine to talk a little bit about the global financial system. So,
of course, he plays a very important role in the discussions. He's at the G20 meetings. He represents especially the 171 countries that aren't part of the G20, because there are 193 members of the United Nations. We have specialized institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which have some systemic responsibility. But I think it's right to understand, and right for viewers to understand, that the real prerogatives are with the powerful countries. The United States and the European countries, China, Japan, they're very jealous of keeping those prerogatives. And that's why one hope is that when the powerful countries meet in the G20 and they see that if they don't cooperate, the bankers end up running circles around them, that maybe we're going to get some intergovernmental cooperation. I don't think it's going to come in the first instance for these macroeconomic issues and these financial issues through the UN system per se. The IMF will play a role, some specialized institutions will. Nation states is still how our world is governed, but the power is often with the banks and with international capital markets. And I think that governments ought to take reflection on what's happened in recent years and realize that cooperation across countries is necessary if our governments really want to collect taxes, if they really want to stop massive tax evasion, if they really want to stop gaming of the international system, so that indeed each bank or each hedge fund or each one says, don't touch me, I'll just move there. Because only global cooperation can keep that under control.
When you talk about, though, the powerful countries, is the geopolitical situation changing now in the world? I mean, we're seeing Europe reaching out to China to ask for help. Russia's talking about maybe giving money to the IMF to bail out and help countries. The balance of power between the rich and the developing, that's changing now, isn't it?
Not only is the balance of power changing, but we're in, I think, one of the most significant historical episodes in modern world history. Of course, the rebalancing of the world economy with the rise of China, with the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, and other emerging economies. This is a big story, and it's a big geopolitical story. But there's another part to reflect on, which is that the U.S. was the centerpiece of the international monetary and financial and economic system from the end of World War II till probably about 10 years ago. The dollar is still the world's key reserve currency. But with the waning of relative U.S. power, the rise of other regional power, we're now in a situation where there isn't a system of leadership right now. History has shown that that's a very dangerous and unstable system unless leadership by one can be replaced by cooperation by the group. But how hard it is for us to cooperate on anything. If we don't cooperate, so it's just a bunch of regional powers that are scrambling with each other, that has been shown time and again to be among the most dangerous times for the planet.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thanks so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.